Something unexpected has recently taken place in Canadian politics. Pierre Poilievre, a figure widely recognized for his sharp criticism, confrontational tone, and aggressive style, has revealed a noticeably different side of himself, one that appears calmer, more controlled, and more deliberate. From an extended conversation on Joe Rogan's podcast to a well-received speech in New York, this version of Poilievre looked very different from what many Canadians are used to, which raises a simple but important question. What caused this shift? Because changes like this rarely happen by chance. They are usually driven by changing circumstances, and in this case, many observers believe that evolving political dynamics, including the presence of Mark Carney, may have played a role.
We're never to forget about the speech that Poilievre gave in New York after the Rogan show. He gave an excellent speech about the situation, the tariffs and so forth between Canada and the United States, explained things very well. Now, I know how it works. There are people around him suggesting things to him, but you sense that that was a speech that he owned. He was very comfortable with, and it was really appreciated. So
over the past few days, Poilievre's visit to the United States has attracted significant attention. His appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast alone introduced him to a massive audience. But what stood out was not just the size of that audience, it was how he conducted himself in that environment. For many viewers, this was a different version of Poilievre. He was not overly combative. He did not interrupt frequently. He avoided turning the conversation into a series of attacks. Instead, he remained composed, conversational, and notably disciplined in how he responded. Even when the discussion moved toward more challenging topics, including figures like Donald Trump, he maintained control and responded carefully. Analysts observing the interview noted that he managed the conversation with a level of precision, staying focused on his message while avoiding unnecessary missteps. And that matters, because appearances like this are often seen as informal tests of how a political figure handles unscripted environments. In this case, many believe he performed effectively. Following the podcast, Poilievre delivered a speech in New York that also received attention. Observers described it as structured, measured, and more policy-focused than some of his previous appearances. He addressed Canada-US trade tensions in a way that was accessible to a broader audience, and even some critics acknowledged that the tone felt more balanced and statesmanlike. This is where the shift becomes more apparent, because this is not only about how something is said, it is about how a political figure positions themselves. For the first time, Poilievre appears to be presenting himself not just as a critic of government, but as someone preparing for a potential leadership role. And that is a fundamentally different position. At the same time, this shift did not emerge in isolation. The political environment around him has been evolving. Continuing with the same approach may have limited his ability to connect with a wider audience. Over recent months, Mark Carney has developed a public profile centered on stability, structured communication, and international engagement. From global meetings to economic discussions and diplomatic interactions, his style has emphasized consistency and control. That has influenced expectations. Voters are not only observing leadership, they are comparing different styles of leadership. And in that comparison, approaches that emphasize calmness and clarity may resonate more strongly during periods of uncertainty. This creates a challenge for any opposition figure. Poilievre's earlier style, built around sharp exchanges and high-intensity rhetoric, has been effective in certain contexts, but some observers have suggested that it may not appeal as strongly to audiences looking for a more measured tone. That does not mean his arguments lack substance. Rather, it highlights how delivery and tone can influence broader public perception. In modern politics, expanding appeal beyond a core base is essential. Elections are not won only by reinforcing existing support. They are won by persuading undecided voters. What we are seeing now may reflect an awareness of that reality, a shift not just in messaging, but in overall presentation.
So he's always managed to get himself into the news. Now he's got to get himself into the news for the right reasons. The two things that an opposition leader has to do: one, hold the government to account. Poilievre's always gotten an A+ on that, going after, prosecuting the government. But his tone is so off-putting that many Canadians just prefer Carney to him. So the other part is showing that they're a government in waiting. And you can't be a government in waiting unless people want to buy in to what you're offering. So he's trying to put in the window of his shop. Kinder, friendlier Pierre Poilievre, yes, who's still going to do his job. If he goes back into the House and stays with the old tone, people are just going to put up their hands and say, okay, nothing's changed.
This is where the broader political context becomes important. Mark Carney's approach has contributed to shaping expectations around leadership style. His emphasis on measured communication, structured decision-making, and international engagement has created a clear contrast in tone. In that contrast, different political approaches naturally stand out. Observers have noted that Poilievre's recent appearances suggest an effort to adjust that contrast, not by abandoning his core positions, but by presenting them in a more controlled and widely accessible manner. This kind of adjustment is not unusual in politics. Leaders often refine their communication strategies as they move closer to potential governing roles. The expectations placed on someone seeking to lead a country are different from those placed on someone focused primarily on critique. There have also been discussions within political circles about the importance of broadening appeal. Reaching beyond a dedicated support base is essential in competitive elections, and that often requires changes in tone and approach. So rather than viewing these recent appearances as isolated moments, they can be seen as part of a larger, strategic adjustment, a shift aimed at presenting a more balanced leadership profile.
He's been somebody for 25 years. Suddenly he's going to be somebody else. I think that's very difficult. On the timing issue, obviously he needs this issue set to change, or he's almost certainly sunk. As long as what we're talking about is Trump, no matter how thoughtful his speeches might be, I just don't think he's going to rank up against the Prime Minister. Last thing I would say is let's put this in historical context. And I know I sound like a rain cloud here, but he's trying to do something really, really difficult, because once the public forms an opinion of an opposition leader, once that is hardened and set, the examples of opposition leaders who've been able to reverse that opinion, change what people think about them, and reinvent themselves, not very many. In fact, I can think of zero. Maybe Joe Clark, but he had to wait until he was a minister before people were willing to accept a new interpretation of it. Very difficult what he's trying to achieve.
However, this is where the situation becomes more nuanced. Performing well in a long-form interview or delivering a structured speech is one thing. Maintaining that same tone consistently in day-to-day political environments is much more challenging. Domestic politics, particularly in parliamentary settings, often encourages direct confrontation and rapid response. That environment can make it difficult to sustain a consistently measured approach. Because of this, some observers remain cautious. There is ongoing discussion about whether this shift represents a long-term change or a temporary adjustment suited to a specific audience and setting. Analysts have pointed out that once Poilievre returns to regular parliamentary debates, the expectations and pressures will be different. The role of an opposition leader often involves strong and immediate responses, which can naturally lead back to a more aggressive style. This creates a potential tension. The version of Poilievre seen in international or controlled settings may not always align with the version seen in more competitive domestic environments, and unless a consistent approach is maintained across both, it may raise questions about authenticity. This is where the challenge becomes more strategic than tactical. It is not just about delivering a strong performance in a single moment. It is about sustaining a clear and consistent approach over time across different platforms and under varying levels of pressure. That is not easy. Political habits develop over years, and public perception can be slow to change. Consistency becomes the key factor in determining whether a shift is seen as genuine. If Poilievre is able to maintain this more composed and structured approach in his domestic political engagements, it could signal a meaningful repositioning. But if there is a visible return to previous patterns, the shift may be interpreted as situational rather than lasting. And in politics, that distinction carries significant weight. At the same time, it is important to recognize that Poilievre is operating within a broader political landscape, one that includes leaders like Mark Carney, whose approach continues to influence how leadership is perceived both domestically and internationally. Competing within that environment requires adaptation, because when expectations change, political strategies often evolve in response. So while Poilievre's recent U.S. visit has been viewed positively by many observers, and while it has highlighted a different side of his public persona, the key question going forward is not whether change is possible, It is whether that change can be sustained over time in a way that aligns with the evolving expectations of leadership in Canadian politics. Subscribe to the channel for clear, balanced, and in-depth analysis on Canada, global politics, and the shifting dynamics shaping the future.